Namo Buddhaya, Namo Dhammaya, Namo Sankhaya. So, Vesak greetings to everyone. And I'm at Tathaloka here at Dhammadharini Monastery, and happy to be together with Wendy Garling and Brenna Artinger. I'm going to be giving an introduction to both of them. This is part of our week of Vesak here at Dhammadharini, and I'll share with you a bit about why we're gathering together, why this is part of our week of Vesak. And first, I just want to say warm welcome to Wendy and to Brenna, and also to just express my happiness that this year our South and Southeast Asian Vesak time is coinciding with the Sakadawa period that celebrates the same three great events in the Buddha's life: the Buddha's birth, awakening, and final nirvana or parinirvana, parinibbana in Pali. So often these are separated by a month or more, not at the same time. But this year, the celebration on our calendars, our lunar calendars, has come together. And we're having a lunar eclipse, supermoon, together with this. So I think a very auspicious time of coming together, and all the more powerful because our different Buddhist traditions are all focusing in this extremely auspicious and beautiful way at the same time together this year. So I'm delighted about that. Now I'd like to give an introduction to Wendy, who we have here with us. Wendy, are you joining us from Massachusetts?
I am, yes.
Yes. And Brenna, where are you joining us from?
I'm in Central California.
Central California. I see. So let me give an introduction. Um, Wendy, Wendy Garling is a writer, mother, scholar, Buddhist practitioner, and Dhamma teacher with an MA in Sanskrit language from UC Berkeley. Her root teacher is His Holiness the 16th Karmapa, who gave her the name Karma Donden Lamo. I might not have pronounced that correctly. You can correct it later on for us. For many years, Wendy has taught women spirituality, focusing on Buddhist traditions, while also pursuing original research into women's stories from ancient Sanskrit and Pali literature. Wendy is the author of Stars at Dawn, Forgotten Stories of Women in the Buddha's Life, and 2016 from Shambhala publication, a groundbreaking biography of the Buddha that relates his journey to awakening through the stories of Buddhism's first women. That's Stars at Dawn, and it's actually part of the inspiration for our get together today. And then more recently, in March of 2021, Wendy has released The Woman Who Raised the Buddha, The Extraordinary Life of Mahapajapati. Does this look backwards to you?
No.
No? Great. To me, it looks backwards. And this is a book that I myself spent many hours with in its formative stages. So I'm delighted to see it take birth this year in March, shortly before this time of Vesak. And I'd like to also introduce Brenna, who is with us together. And Brenna was actually part of the inspiration for our get together today for Vesak. When she was here, when they were here at our monastery, we were speaking in circle about what we thought or felt would be inspiring to be offering and sharing at this time. And Brenna said that they would like to learn more about the history related to Bhikkhunis and women in Buddhism. And this led me to thinking, with regards to Vesak and the three great events that we celebrate on this full moon: the birth, the great awakening, and final nirvana, parinibbana of the Buddha, and the role of important women in the Bodhisattva and the Buddha's life in these great events. And when I was pondering about this, then right away my thoughts went to Wendy and the work that she has done with both of these books. And actually both of them touch in on this very topic. So she seemed like an ideal person to bring into the conversation about this question. So now I'd like to give an further introduction to Brenna. Brenna is the incoming president of the Alliance for Bhikkhunis, which is one of the organizations that has made a big difference for the revival of the Theravada Bhikkhuni Sangha internationally. Recently, during this time of COVID, offering essential support for Bhikkhunis around the world hit hard by the pandemic, especially in India, Thailand, Sri Lanka, and in Europe and the Czech Republic, and yes, also here in the United States. Brenna recently gained a master's in philosophy from University of Oxford, also studying Sanskrit, with research focusing on exclusion and extremism, kind of the opposite of how I sense early Buddhist values. And also in a way, it seems kind of like the opposite of Wendy's work with reviving inclusivity for women in Buddhism, which we could say, we'll see what Wendy would like to say. I would say in Wendy's work, she's really doing a kind of a remediation in terms of really bringing the women in the Buddhist path, the Buddhist teaching, the Buddhist life back into a more front and center position, together with the Buddha and the Bhikkhu Sangha and the great male leaders of the Sangha. So coming back to Brenna, Brenna's been doing some really interesting work lately that I just saw about today when I was searching for a bio on her. Although I've known her for years, I never read her bio before. And I saw that she's been doing some work with Anne Gleig. Is it pronounced Gleig? With Anne Gleig during our winter retreat time on the Buddhist culture wars. I don't know what that means, but apparently there's going to be a paper coming out on it shortly, and I saw that she and Anne had given a talk or a seminar on the Buddhist culture wars from snowflake sanghas to alt-right Buddhism. So, wow, my goodness. I think we're going to be hearing more from you. And I acknowledged already, Brenna, the inspiration that you were in the idea for us to come together today at this time. So there are a couple of things that I would like to ask Wendy about, if it would be all right to go ahead. But first, is there anything that you would like to say by way of introduction or welcome, or to correct anything that I might have not said right with your biographies?
Well, I'll just say thank you very much for inviting me, and what you said about my biography is fine, and thank you for mentioning the books. I think if people are interested in what I say today, the books will tell them much, much more. But happy Vesak to everyone, and I'm very, very happy to be here and to be joining you wherever you are. I hope everyone is well and safe.
Sadhu, sadhu. Brenna, do you have something that you would like to share?
Also, just thank you for inviting me. And it's really lovely to have this conversation and to bring more awareness to the work, especially that you do, Wendy, and on the history of the stories of the early Buddhist nuns and women. And yeah, and it's really lovely to have this conversation and to let people know about this kind of history.
So then I may go ahead with my first and primary question for Wendy, if the time is right. Okay, so in the three great events in the Buddha's life that we commemorate on Vesak, and please correct my pronunciation, Sakadawa Duchen, the Bodhisattva's birth, great awakening, and final nirvana, nibbana. I want to ask about the role of the very important women in the Buddha's life at these three times, in these great moments, in these great events that we're remembering and commemorating now.
Okay. Well, I will give you the short version, but beginning with the birth of the Buddha, in fact, all these three events, what the traditional stories tell us usually excludes women almost completely. And what I found in my research, and my research involved going back to Sanskrit and Pali sources, either in the original or as they've been translated into other languages, for example, the Sanskrit into Tibetan or Chinese and the Pali into Burmese and so forth. I wasn't reading in those languages, but I was reading in translations of those stories. When you read across the text, you find that women were very involved throughout the Buddha's life, and that what's come down to us is a very narrow slice, a very androcentric, a very male-centered slice of his biography. And when you read across the text, you find the stories are very rich, not just with stories of women, but stories of relationship and stories of people who were very instrumental along his path, especially women, not just even women, but especially women. So beginning with the birth, first of all, I'll say normally we're told that Maya, the Buddha's mother, ended up in Lumbini's grove kind of by accident. And in fact, when you read across the text, she was going to a birthing place. This was a sacred place for women to give birth, and she went there with women. And in fact, some stories say men weren't even allowed because it was sacred for women in childbirth. And this Lumbini's grove, named after her mother or grandmother, was presided over by a goddess who was seen as a protective goddess while women were giving birth. So that really changed my understanding of the birth and how it's been so focused on, canonical texts that describe, don't even give Maya a name, but describe an immaculate body that gave birth, and that the Buddha, the Bodhisattva, was born pure and unsullied by human substances. And in fact, when you read the stories across the text, you find a very beautiful, very natural story of women helping women, and Maya giving birth surrounded by women. And I feel the introduction of Brahma and Indra and the male gods must have been added much later. In any case, I think the most important aspect of the birth that I brought forth in both of my books, but I feel is so important to Buddhism generally, is that when Maya gave birth, as I'm sure all of you know, she dies within 7 days. But when Maya gave birth, she was standing and she was holding the branch of the Shala tree. And the tree is the goddess tree of this birthing area, and that she is animated by the wisdom of the goddess. And she was helping Maya, and she lowered her branch to help Maya, give Maya support. But what I want to say that is always omitted in the stories, except in some Burmese sources I found, is that on Maya's left was her sister, Mahaprajapati. So the two women were together, and I see them as almost co-birthing the Buddha in that moment. Mahaprajapati was holding her sister Maya around the waist and was there to support her. And of course, little did they know that Maya would not survive the birth and that she dies within 7 days. And I see that as so symbolic that both mothers were present at the birth. And after Maya gave birth with her womb, Ma Prajapati picked up the baby and gave him milk from her breast. She was already feeding her own child, and she was able to do so. So in many ways, it was a seamless transition from mother to mother. And in my books, I address the fact that first of all, Ma Prajapati is so dismissed or so ignored in the text, but also when she's mentioned as a foster mother or an aunt, or these sort of distancing terms. And I immediately establish that in my mind, they were both mothers. They were mothers in different ways to the Buddha. So I think in terms of the birth story, that's the most important thing I want to mention. I'll also mention, though, that the whole universe celebrated, and it celebrated through the flowers and the trees bursting into bloom. And it celebrated with goddesses, not gods. I'm sure they were there too, but with goddesses appearing and rejoicing that Maya had given birth. So it was a very joyful time. And when you read some of the Sanskrit and some of the, especially in the Sanskrit, but also in the Burmese text, it's celebrated, especially by women, supporting Maya in this very female, feminine moment of giving birth. That's the short version. When we go to the Enlightenment, first of all, you know, he spent 6 years practicing austerities, and there were women along the way in those stories, especially Sujata, who gave him the rice milk as his last meal prior to enlightenment. And it was the food that nourished him for 49 days, because he fasted after that meal for 49 days as he attained enlightenment that night, and then had 7 more weeks of fasting. And while he sort of, I call it sort of processed the enlightenment experience and what he was going to do next. But Sujata is also often overlooked. And later, I think it's in the Parinirvana Sutra, the Buddha mentions the 2 most important meals that are ever given to a Buddha. And one is the last meal prior to enlightenment, and that was given by Sujata. And the other one is the last meal prior to the parinirvana, or the death, which is given by a man, Chunda, which is described in the Parinirvana Sutra. But what I want to say about Sujata is she was a mother. She wasn't a maiden, as is often sort of cast in the story. She was a young mother. And there's all this symbolism of milk and producing milk to feed the Buddha, even though she didn't obviously nurse him, but she fed him also with milk, and this symbolism of motherhood. And the Sanskrit sources also say that in a past life, she had been his mother for many lifetimes, and that her process of feeding him was similar to her past lives, where she fed all of the bodhisattvas their last meal prior to enlightenment. So she is also a very important figure that we know very little about, that we should also remember. And it's said that she wanted to become a Buddha herself in some stories, and that when she gave the offering to the Buddha, she said, "May I become a Buddha?" And then she does. And that's affirmed in some of the texts. And the Buddha also affirmed that in the text that she had been his mother in past lives. So she's a woman of very little prominence in the traditional text, but I think we need to elevate her to the prominence that she deserves. In terms of the Enlightenment itself, again, I'll be brief, but we've heard about the earth goddess appearing to the Buddha, or the Bodhisattva, as the Enlightenment experience is kind of mounting. And the stories of her are very beautiful. And some she emerges completely from the earth, you know, with these enormous breasts. And in some stories, she has battalions of women who are all fighting Mara on the Bodhisattva's behalf. So there's a strong feminine presence during the Enlightenment. And when he touches the earth, of course, she then validates that he is entitled to the Enlightenment. He is properly sitting on the Bodhimanda, on the Bodhi seat, where Mara is trying to displace him and say, no, I belong there. That, you know, I should say, trying to elbow him out of the way and say, I should be sitting there. And Prithvi, the earth goddess, is the one to validate Gautama Buddha's claim to that seat, and to validate, based on the merit that he'd accumulated for countless lifetimes, he deserved to be there. And indeed, he was the proper person becoming enlightened at that moment. But one other aspect that's I had never seen, and I think has been completely overlooked, is there was another goddess present.
Oh.
That was the goddess of the Bodhi tree. And this was a goddess, she didn't have a name, unfortunately, but she appears in the Mahavastu. And it's her job to take care of the Bodhi tree from Buddha to Buddha to Buddha. And she's very feminine. She separates from the tree, the Bodhi tree, in preparation for his arrival. And she sweeps it, and she scatters flower petals and she sprinkles it with water to keep the dust. In India, traditionally, you always sprinkle water to keep the dust down. And it's very sweet and very brief, but I have a feeling that there are stories that have been suppressed about her as well, that we have lost, because she plays a very important role. And at one point she scolds Mara and says, "What are you doing? You're trying to intervene, and it's a fool's errand. Give it up, because this is meant to be, the Buddha is meant to be enlightened." So she takes on a very sort of very human aspect in this moment of scolding Mara and saying, be gone, I mean, let's get this over with. The Buddha has arrived. The Buddha is being enlightened, becoming enlightened as we speak. So these stories are forgotten. And one more story about the Enlightenment is his mother Maya, his birth mother Maya, in the stories does not disappear from the stories in the Sanskrit sources, but she becomes a goddess in heaven, and she's present as a mom in heaven. Doesn't have any special powers except she's a goddess. And at the time of his enlightenment, she's watching over him. And she's very, very worried, because even though the prophecy is that he will attain enlightenment, she's a mom and she's worried about him and she's not so sure. So when he finally succeeds, it is her love that's been watching over him. She is so overjoyed that she goes to the palace where her former husband is asleep, and she shapeshifts into a servant girl, and she announces to the king and to the Siddhartha, the previous the Siddhartha, who the Buddha was previously, Siddhartha's wife, Yashodhara, she announces with great joy that the Buddha succeeded in his enlightenment and that the prophecy was fulfilled. So again, we've lost that feminine aspect of the Enlightenment. And again, the universe is celebrating. I mean, the flowers are bursting into bloom out of season, and the trees throughout the cosmos are celebrating. So this beautiful feminine aspect of the Enlightenment also has been lost. So going to the parinirvana, first of all, we don't know that women were present, but they were. We find this out in a number of the texts that say the village, he didn't die in a monastery. He died out in the open. And the villagers the Buddha said, go tell the people in the village that this is taking place, because they would not want to not know. So I think it was Ananda or someone went and notified the villagers. And so the Buddha was surrounded by the townspeople, I'm sure monastics as well, but it was then the mayor of the town who organized the women to carry the cape over the procession when he died. It was women and girls, and it was specifically mentioned that it was women and girls who did so. And then there was a prominent woman named Malika, in another story, who donated precious cloth to wrap the corpse in, or to wrap the coffin in, I guess. But anyway, women were completely present at the time of the Buddha's passing. And again, the universe rejoiced there in the sense of sadness but poignancy that the end of a Buddha era had just taken place. So that now the flower petals that are falling are more like tears. But it's this mixed blessing of now the Dharma is in the world again. The Dharma has returned. The Buddha is gone, but the Dharma has returned. And it was the beginning of this magnificent new era. And that the Buddha had well established in his teachings that the Dharma could flourish. So once again, there's a sense of celebration, although obviously more somber at the death of the Buddha. And one last story here, Maya again comes down from heaven. And this is not captured in really any of the texts except a Sanskrit text that, as far as I know, has been lost in the original Sanskrit, but they have found it in the Chinese in a translation. But this story says that now Maya once again is witnessing what's happening with her son, and she comes down to pay one last visit to him. And normally we're told that the last person to have contact with the Buddha is Mahakashapa. And I feel that's been totally androcentrized. I mean, that Maya has been robbed of this story, when in fact it was Maya, which kind of makes much more sense. she comes down, and again, she's mom, so she's weeping, and he sits up and he gives her one last teaching on impermanence and says, no, this is the natural way. This is the way it's supposed to be. And then she honors him and scatters some flower petals and returns to heaven. And that is his last contact before he completely goes out. And to support the ancient quality of that story, I want to say, some people might say, well, if it was found in China, maybe it was made up much later. And that could often, in some cases, be the case. I tend to think that just because we've lost the Sanskrit original doesn't mean it didn't come from India. And this story definitely came from India. It came because the Chinese pilgrims who traveled through India to the holy sites in the 5th and 7th centuries knew the story of Maya coming, and they heard it in India, of Maya coming down to be the last visitor to her son. And in fact, they recorded that there was a stupa in Kushinagar where the Buddha passed away. There was a stupa built to honor Maya's visit, and it was specifically to honor Maya's visit to her son. And we don't know where that stupa is now in Kushinagar, but it was recorded and observed by the 2 pilgrims who went to Kushinagar that long ago. So again, that's a story that we've lost, but it was his mother who went to have his final teaching. And that teaching then was heard by everyone who'd congregated. And it was the teaching he always gave at the time of death. It was the teaching he gave at the time of Mahaprajapati's death. He gave a eulogy and a teaching. And of course, it embodies this notion of impermanence. So there's more in my books, but you see how these events were full of the presence of women and the sacred feminine, not just a little bit, but a lot. And I think we need to remember those and bring those back. And I thank you for inviting me to tell the stories, because I love to do that, and I feel they're so important. And I invite everyone to bring them into their own narratives of the Buddha's life, because these are from the ancient primary Sanskrit and Pali sources. And I believe this is how these stories were once told before they kind of got, before they got androcentrized. I think I invented that, but made more and more focused on the male, on the men.
You didn't invent that word. In fact,
okay.
I was just thinking of something interesting. You know, I learned the word, what is it, anthropocentric?
Yeah.
I've known that word for some period of time. I don't know how many years I've known that word. But a couple of years ago, then there was someone, a male scholar, who wrote to me, who had been looking, because I also like telling these stories together with sharing the visual images, and it's something that I've found interesting and inspiring myself. And then I love to share what's interesting and inspiring. And if 1 or 2 other people or 100 or 1,000 other people also find it inspiring and uplifting and motivating, then, you know, all the better. But this scholar wrote to me and said that he had observed my work to be somewhat, I'm not even sure how to pronounce it because I read it, gynocentric or gynocentric. Mm-hmm. And I hadn't, so I've known this word anthropocentric for years and years. Huh? Oh, I'm sorry. Androcentric is the more correct, is correct. So maybe I don't really know, but anyway, I've heard something that sounded like that and read something that looked kind of like that many times over the years. But then I was looking at this particular message and like, what is that? And I had to look it up because I was actually not familiar with that word. And then it said something like, you know, in comparison to what is like androcentric patterns where the men are focused on in the stories, and the story seems to be like all about the man and all about the men, and they're the really important and key players in the story, the gynocentric or gynocentric. Are you checking the pronunciation? That this is like more focused on, you know, moralizing the women's presence and the women's stories, and really seeing them as important and as important figures, as important players in whatever was unfolding. And I thought, well, yes. So I had thought to ask you if you considered, like when I was listening to you tell this story now, I was thinking, what's the pronunciation? gynocentric. I was thinking, wow, do you view your tellings of these three great events and of these occasions in the Buddha's life? Or, I mean, of course, it's not only the Buddha's life, right? It's all of these people's life and awakening together. I was wondering if you would view that as being gynocentric, or if you'd even heard of the word before, because I hadn't, and I was just amazed that I hadn't.
Well, if you're asking me if I think these stories are gynocentric, I think.
No, you're telling. You're telling.
Well, I think this is the way the stories were told.
Yes.
And it's probably very much the way things happened. I mean, it's not that men aren't mentioned in these stories, but I just find it more balanced. And certainly a birth story shouldn't be focused on Brahma and Indra, right? I mean, the birth stories should be focused on the birth itself. And I feel that it makes more sense that it was very inclusive of women. I hope ultimately we get away from androcentric, gynocentric, and we just sort of get into a balance between the male and the female or whatever. But in bringing these stories back, I think somewhat strongly, it's to override, I think, this sort of default to the male position on the male details. So I think, especially in my first book, I'm a little bit sort of maybe more forceful about saying, wait a minute, stop, this is not the way the stories were told. And I think my second book is a little bit less so, but I just want to restore balance. I think we need to restore balance. There were men and women present. There were men and women disciples, obviously. And I just think we need to also realize the benefit brought to the Buddha through all these relationships, not just that he imparted benefit to them, but that, they imparted benefit to him. They supported him. The support he got every step of the way, whether it was from sort of a mystical source, like the tree that protected him when he was a little boy meditating. She was that tree that provided the shade. For those of you who know that story, she was a goddess who was doing exactly what she knew was the right thing to do, because she was trying to enable this process of his own awakening. So she created the shade to give him the comfort and the safety that he could meditate, because in the hot Indian sun, you needed that shade. But it was it was a wisdom goddess, I call them, just like the goddess at his birth, or the Bodhi tree. These trees appear embodying the wisdom of the goddess, or of women, or of the earth, I would say the sacred feminine. But I guess my ultimate goal is to strike a balance.
Yes, I really appreciate this. The point is not to go from like excluding one group and then move over to exclude another group, or from one extreme to another extreme, but towards inclusivity and balance. I really appreciate that. Something else that I was reflecting on in what you were sharing, you mentioned about some people thinking that like maybe the Chinese texts are lighter and this kind of thing. And I've just come to realize, just I'd say like in this last year, the last couple of years, that really the texts that we have from the like Khandara area are in fact, I think, the oldest textual records that exist. And from the work that the scholars have been doing, it looks like really most of the text translated into Chinese came via that route. So they came from India, then into the northwestern frontier regions, which became a great, absolutely, incredible and probably even world-renowned Buddhist civilization that lasted for such a long time. Even to be considered a kind of paradise like Shambhala. So this is where most of the textual traditions that then came into China and were translated into Chinese then passed over time through that route along the Silk Road. So, of course, by sea with some of the pilgrims as well, who came by land and came by sea. So I just found that interesting, because it really shines a different light on like what is early, what is ancient, the time frames, and how the Dhamma and how these traditions have flowed. over time. One more thing that I thought to mention is with Sujata, you know, the Alliance for Bhikkhunis founder, Susan Pembroke. Now she's retired, but the first president of the Alliance for Bhikkhunis, then she and others came up with the idea of International Bhikkhuni Day. And really just like having a day to celebrate the Bhikkhunis every year. And we looked at different times, and then we decided on around the September full moon, which is in Sri Lanka traditionally the anniversary of the founding of the Bhikkhuni Sangha, when Mahapajapati Gautami and her 500 Parivara entourage of greatly aspiring women, Shakyan women, then requested ordination. Then now, oh, my tech support is looking at me here. Because of that traditionally being around September, that time was chosen. But one year, they decided, the Alliance for Bhikkhunis decided to focus and to feature. For a while, every year there was like a feature of some great women who were focused on for that year for International Bhikkhuni Day. And Sujata was chosen for 1 year. So many people then learned about her life, learned about how she appears in the different traditions. I remember also learning more and just being so, so touched and so moved. Sharing Dhamma talks about that. The Alliance for Bhikkhunis has a whole collection then from that year's International Bhikkhuni Day on Sujata. And also the first time that I went to Bodh Gaya and being able to visit the Sujata Stupa. So this isn't all just old texts. Wendy and I have had quite a lot of time looking at like different ancient pieces of ancient art together, whether it's old Chinese cave paintings that are depicting Mahamaya together with the Buddha at the time of the Parinibbana, that are then related to the Mahamaya Sutra that Wendy was talking about, or whether it's the stone carved images of Mahamaya standing with Mahapajapati, as Wendy said, not only in the text, but in these ancient carvings. And we feel in some ways that the text might be more malleable, more changeable. But once you've carved something in stone, if it survives for 1,000 years or more, you feel it's a reasonable record of what they were thinking at that time, what story they were holding at that time. So it's been so interesting and revealing and inspiring. It's a really different sense of not only history, or not only her story, but really of our story, our story together. Brenna, do you have anything that you would like to ask, or any reflection that you'd like to share? What you've just heard Wendy speak about, the strong presence of these very important women in the Buddha's life related to these three great events?
Yeah, I'm not sure if we can cover this question later too, if it's not so relevant right now, but my sort of first question was because from what I've read of your work, Wendy, a lot of what you're looking at is sort of the texts and the depictions of these women early in the Buddha's life and in the early sort of textual canon of how they're presented. And a lot of the work that I do, especially with the Alliance for Bhikkhunis, is very like here and now, right? I mean, we try to do some work on the history as well, but really we're focused on making sure Bhikkhunis have enough food and a stable place to live, and really ensuring their survival in many respects. So I was just wondering, how do you see your work relating to it could be women generally, or to the lay women practitioners, or to the monastics? How do you see that kind of intermeshing of tradition and practice?
You know, Brenna, I feel like this also might relate to my question number 2. So perhaps we
Okay.
can combine them. I don't know. I can share with you what that is, and it might be that there's a kind of alignment here
Okay.
in this. Perhaps means like how does it relate, right? Is the question. Let me just check on this and see. So my second question for Wendy had been, why do you feel it is timely and important for us, our lives and our world, to be sharing your work as expressed in Stars at Dawn and The Woman Who Raised the Buddha, Mahaprajapati? What is the sign of the times that you are sensing which calls for this work and makes it feel so compelling and so important?
Well, I feel there's changes happening around the world. It's not just within Buddhism, where I feel there's a, a longing or to learn about our foremothers. I know when I first came to Buddhism, I sort of took it as it came, and I heard the story of the Buddha, which was very much, the story of a solitary young man who went off on a, quest for truth and became enlightened. And there was no mention of women and not even mention of many other participants. I took that for granted and I didn't think about it. But as I deepened my own practice and traveled more and so forth, I started to wake up to the fact that story felt incomplete. I think that many people, and maybe especially women, are having similar experiences in other cultures and other religions. You look at, the interest of women's stories in American history. I just read the other day that Paul Revere wasn't the only one who rode, to announce the British were coming. There was a 16-year-old girl who rode on a horse all the way to Connecticut and back, and she beat him by miles.
Wow.
And she's been forgotten. And that story is reemerging. And I thought, yes, these stories of women have been forgotten everywhere. So yes, in Buddhism, for some reason, it just became my passion. I became interested, or I became aware that there were alternatives to the normal sort of trimmed down version of the Buddha's life in graduate school. And I came across some texts. And then it was a few decades later that I returned to them and began to build the research for my books. But I feel the world is really ready for these stories. I think patriarchy has kind of hit a wall, and I think we read the paper, we hear the news, the violence, the wars, the destruction of our planet. I mean, everything's kind of coming together right now with, and I don't mean to say it's all, again, to create this polarization of male and female, but we're losing touch with our earth and the healing that we learn from the earth. And you see that in the ancient stories I described, where the earth rejoiced at the birth of a Buddha. What does that mean to the world? It brings harmony, it brings dharma. Everybody benefits, everybody. And the natural world would celebrate. I feel now we're decimating that same natural world. And it's the voice of the feminine that is speaking again, voice of the nurturers. And I don't mean to classify mothers per se, but the nurturers, those who preserve and protect, are reemerging. So I feel my work is just a small piece of that. And yet I think within Buddhism, these early stories have got to be remembered. And I feel also that so often, and I want to say this, the women who lived during the time of the Buddha are often, or all those stories are shoehorned into, well, that's early Buddhism, or that's Pali Buddhism, or that's Vipassana Buddhism. And I would argue, no, this is pre-sectarian Buddhism. This is the Buddha. He was the teacher then. And these women who learned from him are the foremothers of all the Buddhist schools. So I feel that's relevant to, I'm a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner, and yet I don't feel any separation from these women. I feel they are my foremothers, even though I learned more about the women saints in Tibet before I learned about the early women. So I feel it connects us to our past, and it gives us a certain strength to be in the world today. It gives us, they kind of have our backs, if you will. And I feel it's certainly deep in my own practice, especially when I reflect as a practitioner on the Buddha's life. I have this sense now of the wholeness of his life and the wholeness of what he, of his teachings, and of how I can integrate those into my own world differently. So that, I think it's a big question, but I feel that these stories have been suppressed for such a long time. And a lot of what I read in translation was found by the Western scholars in the 1800s and 1900s. And I feel they were suppressed all over again. This was the patriarchy, Victorian patriarchy, you know, the white men who conquered Asia. And these were some of the scholars who brought the stories back. And here and there were stories of women, and they just sat on library shelves. And I had library passes too. I found some of these. They had been translated, but they had been ignored. So I feel that they were sort of ignored over and over again, but now they're relevant. Now we want these stories. We're hungry for these stories within Buddhism. And I think generally in the world, women's stories are starting to make more sense to all of us and help us.
Well, I saw a list that someone had compiled about like most important or consequential works to be emerging in Buddhism within, I think it was compiled last year, and it was related to the previous couple of years. And Stars at Dawn was there in the like top strata.
Wow.
In terms of what they consider to be like really important, emerging, and meeting the need, or really like serving our contemporary interests and situation in Buddhism. So I know that Brenna cannot stay with us so much longer, and so I just want to check in. I don't know if what Wendy just said spoke to your question or not, or I want to check in. Is there with you something else particularly that you would like to ask, like to reflect on while you're here together with us?
Yeah, I just had one more thing that I like to ask, and it kind of relates to a little bit what you said just now. And there's been some, especially in Buddhist scholarship, some discussion lately about especially the role of, practitioners of Buddhism interpreting early Buddhist texts. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts of that. I mean, you were just talking about the I guess the Western, especially the British colonial powers who took these texts and translated them. But then also, I was wondering how you view your particular lens as, well, a woman, but also, a Western woman in interpreting these texts and, expounding upon them, and what does that mean to you?
Well, there are a lot of texts, and they're very different. Stories are stories. And I felt a commonality with the women and with the humans that lived at that time. I obviously bring to the table my own biases, my own cultural roots, my own whiteness, my own Westernness. I tried my best not to bring that forward. But at the same time, I guess that's not true. I mean, on the one hand, I didn't, but on the other hand, I was, speaking in many times in the voice of a feminist, pointing out sexism, pointing out domestic abuse in some stories, pointing it out. And, maybe they didn't see it that way 2,500 years ago, but in many cases they did. And I felt that kind of comradeship with the narrator of some of the stories, because some of the stories that were horrific were told as horrific stories. They weren't told naively. So every text is different. I delight in storytelling, and I delight in the mystery of the stories. And often what I found was not a complete story, but fragments. So partially as a scholar, but also just someone who likes to, likes archaeology, to find fragments and then put them together and to see this is probably how the story was once told. It was very stimulating to me, my curiosity and my imagination too. You have to use imagination when you find all these fragments and you have to put them together. So the texts were a huge challenge, but I also feel that human beings are human beings, and cultures are different, but there was so much I could relate to in the stories. Also, as a mother, I mean, the stories of Maya and her pregnancy, there's lots of stories of her pregnancy. There's stories we can all relate to. As a laywoman, I was interested in the stories of the Bhikkhunis before they took ordination. What were their lives like? And we get a lot of that from the Therigatha and the Theriabhidhanas. But we also learned, like in my second book, I wanted to know who was Mahapajapati before she ordained. She ordained in her 60s. So she was his mother. There's a huge story back there. So that was what inspired my second book. Anyway, the texts are mysterious and challenging and fabulous. And they tell us a lot about the past, but they also tell us a lot about ourselves.
Sadhu. Very true. Thank you very much, Brenna Artinger, President of the Alliance for Bhikkhunis, and Wendy Garling, author of The Woman Who Raised the Buddha, The Extraordinary Life of Mahapajapati, and Stars at Dawn, Forgotten Stories of Women in the Buddha's Life. Thank you for joining us for our Vesak, exploring the role of women in the Buddha's life in the three great events of the birth, the Great Awakening, and final passing of the Buddha. And I'd like to invite everyone, I'd like to let you know that we're also going to be having time with Deepak Anand live in India to be exploring. We'll be looking at the Sujata Stupa and temple and exploring the area of Uruvela and the final day of the Buddha's life leading up to his Great Awakening, and together with a number of the pilgrim scholars and interpreters live from those sites during this time. So anyone who goes to Dhammadharini.net, you can see the programs and join in live or see the YouTubes afterwards on the Dhammadharini Monastery YouTube channel. And just thank you very much to both of you. I would like to close with mindful of Wendy's newest book, which we've spent many hours with together, and in fact years now, not only hours, but and weeks and months, but years. I'd like to share some words and homage to the Buddha. They're the words of Mahapajapati. Go to me, Theri, from her Theri Gatha verses. So, Buddha, hero, homage to you, highest of all beings, you who released me and so many other people from suffering. I've comprehended all stress, dried up craving, the cause, developed the Eightfold Path, and touched cessation. Before I was mother, son, father, brother, grandmother, not knowing things as they were, I wandered on without respite. But now that I've seen the Blessed One, this is my last body. Birth and wandering on are totally ended. There is now no further becoming. I see the disciples gathered, their persistence aroused, resolute, constant, in strong exertion. This is the worship of the Buddhas. Truly for the benefit of many did Maya give birth to Gautama, thrusting away the mass of pain of those mired in illness and death. Of Mahapajapati Gautami, Theri Gatha. So just thought to share that with enormous appreciation to Mahapajapati for, in so many ways, as the second mother, co-mother of the Buddha, and as the founding mother of the Bhikkhuni Sangha, and of Wendy for really, I just sense you giving your whole heart to the sharing of these stories, and to the inclusivity, balancing, and the power of what there is in our ancient heritages from Buddhism to really inspire, uplift, and awaken all of us. And thank you very much to Brenna for the inspiration, that the idea that has drawn us together, in fact, today, and for all of your great support, for all the people who've wished to see the revival of the Theravada Bhikkhuni Sangha in the world, for your being a torchbearer and holding up the lamp in this regard. So both of you, I think about you being as torchbearers in the Buddha Sasana in this time. So sadhu to you for this. Thank you very much, and blessings of Vesak to you and to everyone who's joining us. May all the blessings of all of these great beings awakening be ours.